Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is our project, and it's about Charles Manson and the Manson family.
The 1960s was a time of many drastic changes. The Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement were the more prominent events during this time. There were also a lot of changes in culture too, like the emergence of rock and roll. With these radical changes came a lot of violence, and people desperately tried to push for peace. Our project focuses on Charles Manson and the murders of the Manson family during the late 1960s. Charles Manson orchestrated several violent murders in the name of central issues in the 1960s, like racial tension between blacks and whites, as well as the Vietnam War. Although the murder count was not very high, these murders were significant enough to strike great fear in the American citizens.
Now, before he led the Manson family, aka the Manson cult, Charles Manson wasn't always the malicious psychopath he was. He was born in 1934 to an unmarried 16-year-old woman named Kathleen Maddox. Kathleen Maddox had run away from her parents and has been drinking heavily ever since. His original name was No Name Maddox, then Charles Miles Maddox. Then, later in his childhood, his mother had remarried a man named William Manson. Hence, the boy was known as Charles Manson. Charles spent the early parts of his life without a mother, as he was raised by his aunt and uncle. His uncle was a rebel and did not like the school Charles attended as he grew up. He grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he was well taught. By then, his mother had become an alcoholic and gone out of prison, and he was sent to a Yankee school. During his childhood, Charles had still followed the words of his uncle, and at the age of 9, Charles Manson set his school on fire. His mother was outraged and sent him to boys' school. There, he stayed for 10 months before finally running away again looking for her. But this time, his mother did not take him back. This was a turning point in Manson's early life. He saw things differently as he realized everything his mother told him was a lie. Ever since then, he lived a life of petty crime. In 1949, he was sent to Boys Town, but ran away 4 days later. The severity of his crimes increased as he went to steal cars and committed his first armed robberies. He was then sent to Indiana School for Boys, but claimed he was raped and ran away 18 times. Several reports from Manson's relatives, acquired by Jeff Gowen, state, little Charlie Manson was a disagreeable child. He lied about everything and always blamed someone else for his actions. Obsessed with being the center of attention, he tried to manipulate everyone. His interest in people was dictated by what they might be able to do for him.
Charles Manson married Rosalie Jean Willis in 1955, and he helped support this short marriage via car theft and part-time jobs. But when Manson, pregnant Rosalie, and Manson's mother moved to California, Charles was convicted for taking a stolen car across state borders and received a 3-year sentence at Terminal Island, San Pedro. During that 3-year sentence, Rosalie Jean Willis gave birth to his son, Charles Manson Jr., and then left him for another man. When Manson was freed from Terminal Island in 1958, he married a prostitute, Leona Candy Stevens, and had another child. They moved to New Mexico for prostitution purposes and was then convicted by the Mann Act. The Mann Act made it a crime to transport someone between states for the purpose of prostitution. He was jailed for 7 years between 1960 and 1967 because of the Mann Act and another federal crime of submitting a false treasury check of $43. Upon release, he began to build his own family, later known as the Manson family.
The family first lived on Spawn Ranch, which was commonly used for movies, and later in Death Valley, where they bribed the blind owner to let them stay. At one point, there were over 100 members of the Manson family who followed him for various reasons. An ex-family member who recalls her experience stated that some of the main things that impressed her about Manson was his sense of brotherhood, loyalty, and honor. These things made them look up to him in a positive light and helped make him seem good and holy. Another reason many turned to Manson was because around this time there was a lot of tension in the country over the Vietnam War. Many were pushing for love and peace, and many expected the end to come in the near future. Manson was able to tap into these fears and expectations, so at first he preached love and peace to people who were most vulnerable. He convinced many that he was the second coming of Christ, and they called him either God or Satan. The family primarily consisted of middle-class white Americans, most of whom were women. Throughout the day, they would lounge around, take drugs, sing, and have sex. From an outsider's perspective, they looked like the stereotypical hippies, but as time progressed, Manson became more violent, taking the family with him. Because they saw him as a holy figure who would lead them through to the end that was sure to come, they were willing to do pretty much what he wanted them to protest against the war. One woman wrote "war" on the belly of a man she killed. and when questioned, she claimed that he would be one less man to send his son off to war. Even though they protested a war in Vietnam, they anticipated a racial war between the whites and blacks, ending with the blacks being victorious. It was expected, but it wasn't happening as soon as the Manson family had hoped, so they took it upon themselves to try and start up a rebellion. The first plan was to create an album with subtle messages that would start the revolution. This was called Helter Skelter. When this failed to work, the family started on the Manson Murders, which were to be blamed on the blacks. These murders were also done to such an extreme that it would get attention from a lot of the white people, causing them to take it out on the blacks who would retaliate, thus starting a race war.
Charles Manson had many reasons why he orchestrated the murders he did. He had been jailed for many years, a huge part of his life, and he was a rebel. Because of this, he developed psychopathic tendencies that affected his personality. His rejection from the Beach Boys also angered him greatly, as he played a lot of music for Dennis Wilson, but his music was never released. The dominant reason, Manson claims, however, he committed these murders is because he believed the Armageddon was imminent. The Armageddon, also called Helter Skelter, was an all-out race war between the African Americans and the whites. While Charles Manson descended into the belief of Helter Skelter, he became even more paranoid and radical about the incoming racial war. He believed that Helter Skelter needed a push start. So Charles Manson killed a drug dealer who threatened to wipe out the Manson family on July 1st, 1969. Bernard Lotsapapa Crow. He later found out on the news the body of a Black Panther and confused it with Lotsapapa. He feared the Black Panther's wrath on his family, and because of this, Manson started killing white citizens instead of blacks. He wanted the murders to be the start of a racial war between African Americans and whites. His plan was to hide out in the desert until the blacks had conquered the whites. Afterwards, Charles Manson and his family would come out and lead the black government.
On July 25, 1969, Charles Manson sent Bobby Buscellelli, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins from his family to the house of Gary Hinman to collect a $21,000 inheritance that he supposedly had. The three family members kept Hinman hostage for 2 days until Buscellel stabbed him at the instruction of Manson. Then one of the three family members wrote "Political Piggy" using his blood on the wall. It also turned out the inheritance money never existed. Using his belief in Helter Skelter as a reason, Charles Manson had sent Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Linda Casabane, and Patricia Krenwinkel to go to the previous house of Terry Melker and totally destroy everyone in it as gruesome as you can. In the house at the time was 8.5-month pregnant Sharon Tate, her friend Jay Sebring, screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski, and Frykowski's lover Abigail Folger. On August 9, 1969, the four family members infiltrated the Tate property and was met by an 18-year-old Stephen Parent pulling up into the driveway. Watson quickly shot him 4 times in the chest. They then entered the house and brought all 4 of the residents into their living room. Watson then shot Jay Sebring for complaining about how they were treating the pregnant Sharon. Watson then stabbed him 7 times. During this commotion, Frykowski and his wife attempted to escape but were stopped short in the backyard by Watson and 2 other family members. Watson proceeded to stab Folger a total of 28 times and Frykowski a total of 51 times. They then confronted Sharon Tate in the living room and they killed her by stabbing her 16 times. Atkins wrote "pig" on the front door of the estate using Sharon Tate's blood. The next day, on August 10, 1969, Manson, Leslie Van Houten, Steve Clem Grogan, and the same 4 who went to the Tate estate, went to 3301 Waverly Drive, where Lino LaBianca and Rosemary LaBianca lived. Lino LaBianca was a supermarket executive, while Rosemary was a dress shop co-owner. After entering their estate, the present Manson family members brought them down to the living room where they tied them up. As they started to resist the intruders, Watson stabbed Lino 12 times with a chrome-plated bayonet, and then Leslie Van Houten carved "War" on his chest. Then Watson and other family members stabbed Rosemary a total of 41 times. As they were leaving, they wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls with LaBianca blood, and on the refrigerator they wrote "Helter Skelter."
First, the police had a hard time pinpointing who was responsible for the murders and didn't make the connection of the murders to the Manson family, partly because the interstate communication was really bad. They didn't communicate with each other enough or compare notes. They were only caught as a whole group when they were caught burning Death Valley National Monument property, which got the officials' attention. Once there, they arrested many of the family members, including previously arrested Bobby Busalil's girlfriend, who helped them connect Busalil to the family. Once this connection had been made, others soon followed.
The trial that followed for the family members was long and tedious. On June 15, 1970, the 225-day trial began with Linda Casabane at the witness stand. Linda took part in both groups that murdered Tate and LaBianca, but because she did not participate in the murders, she was granted immunity in exchange for testimony that detailed the nights of the crimes. After many disruptions from the other family members outside the courthouse, Susan Atkins, Charles Manson, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel were found guilty for multiple charges of murder and conspiracy on January 25, 1971. They were later sentenced to death on April 19, 1971. Also, later that year, Texas police found Charles Tex Watson, and who was quickly found guilty and then sentenced to death. But in February 1972, the sentence the family members received was replaced by life in prison due to the death sentence being abolished in California.